This summer, Mr. Mayer discussed his book, Dr. Spock, An American Life, about Dr. Benjamin Spock's rise from an unknown pediatrician and child psychologist to best-selling author. The event, hosted by the New England Psychoanalytic Association, is about 55 minutes.
I'd like to welcome you all today to the lecture, Thomas Mayer's lecture on Spock in American Life. And we're going to learn about how Spock used Freud in his work in his famous book and his connection to Freud, besides learning a little bit about his history and his life. And I'd like to tell you a little about Thomas Mayer, our speaker today. He's an award-winning investigative reporter for Newsday, aside from writing books and working on biographies. And he has won the top reporting prize of the National Honor Society of Professional Journalists in 1987 and in 1995. And I would like him to come up now to the podium and give us his views on Spock and how he came to write this book, and tell us a little bit about the history of the book, besides learning about Spock. Thomas Mayer.
Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me and having me here today. You know, one of the ways that I'd like to start, if I could, is by telling a little story about Ben Spock, who was kind of, as he would say, at best, a C-plus student when he was an undergraduate at Yale, but came to New York and managed to go to Columbia Medical School, where he wound up becoming the #1 person in his class. He graduated at the top of his class. He very much applied himself to his studies. And Ben, who was kind of modest and self-effacing in his humor, would often tell the story of the reaction of a friend of his, a fellow student of his at Columbia Medical School, upon learning that Ben had been the top of his class. He turned to Spock and said, "Spock, of all people, I thought you were stupid." Well, Ben would often have a good laugh at himself about that, but in many ways Spock was quite the contrary, quite wise about human nature, about what makes us tick, and I think in many ways the popularity, the lasting popularity of his baby book, even today, which sells about 750,000 copies, and for most of its 50-year duration had sold in the area of about 1 million copies a year, is testament to the inherent wisdom about the human species. If I could, I'd like to just talk about Ben in general, Dr. Spock, and also talk about then his impact on popularizing Freud in this country, and also about his other lessons from his life about which he would call seeing that pediatrics is part of the political process, and how he incorporated his views about pediatrics into his political views. Also, I'd like to talk as well about his personal life, which both informs so much of his writings and at times actually is contradictory to some of his best advice. So if I could, just by beginning, you know, when people have asked me, why is it that I wanted to write about Dr. Spock? Well, it's in a way very simple. I have a book at home, one of these millennium type of books or end of the century type of editions. This, I think it was of Esquire magazines, and it said 50 Americans who made a difference. And I know Life magazine had another one that I have, of the 100 most important Americans of the 20th century. And when you look at that list of the 100 most important Americans of the 20th century, you'd see names like Franklin Roosevelt, Babe Ruth, virtually every name that you could think of. And on that list is Ben Spock, and he was one of the few people that was on that list that was still alive. So between that and knowing people that knew Spock and making entrees into to Ben's world through his friends, I came to write about his book, to write this book about him. But one of the things that I think is also important to recognize about Spock is that Spock, in many ways, represented so much of who we are as a people, as the American people. His life embraced the entire 20th century in America and reflects so much of who we are as a people. Biography, in many respects, to me, is a wonderful window into some general themes. You can follow it if you choose wisely. You can follow an individual life through a certain period of time, and so many of the themes and cross currents of that time are reflected or can be reflected in this person's life. And I would submit that Dr. Spock's life is very much reflective of America in the 20th century. I begin the book on the sleeping porch in New Haven, Connecticut. His mother was a devotee of fresh air, and her devotion to fresh air was later incorporated in Ben Spock's book. And I think almost every time you see a child out there in the cold, brisk, fresh air, somehow I think it's somehow traceable to Mildred Spock's, Ben's mother's, belief that fresh air was not only good for the health and the constitution of a young child, but also for their moral health as well. And so his life, in many ways, starts from in a period that doesn't really exist anymore, a Victorian New England time period. Spock later during the 20s, as I talk about the broad 20th century in America, in the 1920s, there he is. He and the Yale crew team are on the cover of Time magazine. Ben Spock was an Olympic gold medal winner. He was the number 7 slot on the Yale crew team that won the gold at the 1924 Paris Olympics. And he's very much part of that era. In the 30s, there he is at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, kind of the mecca of Freud at that time in America. And he's there delivering Margaret Mead's baby. He's there for that, and he's very much part of the popularization of Freud that comes later on. In the 40s, he's writing the baby book, for which he's becomes later well known. In the 50s, he in many ways is the father of America's baby boom generation. He's the one who often becomes the Bible for so many parents who are moving out to the suburbs and no longer have the advice of a grandmother or some grandparent. In the old neighborhood, they have moved out to places like Levittown or to other places in the suburbs of America, needing that practical advice that Ben Spock offers. And the book is a supremely practical book in that respect. It's in many ways one of the greatest self-help books of all time as well. In the 60s, Ben Spock reflects in many ways the changes in America. So there down State Street in Chicago is Ben Spock walking with Martin Luther King against racism and against what they both consider an unjust war. In the 1970s, again, as America reappraises the role of women as an example, there has been, and Gloria Steinem, in many ways, in a confrontation between the roles of men and women in our society. And even right up until his death, which occurred at age 94 this past March, Ben Spock was very vibrant, very much making news. His suggestion for a vegetarian diet for children was born of his own experience, but also was something that, like most great teachers, and Ben Spock was very much a great teacher, he always tried to be a few steps ahead of where we were going as a people. And so there he is. His writings are on the internet, in magazines, to the very end. If I could, I'd like to start, though, by talking about how Ben Spock married, if you will, the hardware of pediatrics with the psychoanalytic principles, the truths that rang true in his own life as he was exposed to the views of Freud and became increasingly interested in them and eventually popularized them by translating them in almost a Huckleberry Finn version of Freud, making them understandable so that people, as I say in my book, that people who would pick up the book would think that the fundamental psychological wisdom in his book was born of the experiences of a Yankee country doctor, rather than a man who had been for 15 years at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, trained by many of Freud's hand-picked analysts. So if I could, I'd like to just start by stepping back a little bit and just explaining, before Ben Spock came along, there was an old school, if you will, of pediatrics, which, to the extent that it existed, pediatrics was very much of the spare the rod and spoil the child school. And America, very much as a fundamentally a conservative country with puritanical roots, very much saw child rearing as an extension of religious beliefs, and by the early part of the 20th century also saw it as, to some extent, an extension of science, its belief in science. By that I mean one of the Dr. Spocks of the early part of the century was a fellow by the name of John Watson. And Watson would basically see children as the same way that Pavlov would see a guinea pig or some other type of lab rat. In fact, indeed, in John Watson's baby book, if you open up the book, if you can find a copy of it, you'll see there's actually a picture of a child sitting next to a lab rat. And basically the theory was that it was in many ways the behaviorist school, that you could basically train a child the same way that Pavlov conditioned animals. There was also, up on Mrs. Spock's, Ben Spock's, Mildred Spock's shelf, was another book by Dr. Holt. And in many ways, he was the advice giver for parents. Dr. Holt's book held true with American parents from about the 1880s up until, in many ways, Dr. Spock's book appeared in the 1940s. And Dr. Holt would advise parents to, as did Watson, to never kiss their children. In fact, the advice was, if you must kiss your children, please do so late at night, be no more than once, or preferably shake hands with your child. Dr. Holt would also be of the belief that a child's urge to suck their thumb was an inherently bad thing, and therefore you would try to break them of that bad habit by tying their hands to the cribs. In fact, I'm sure you probably even heard of those type of stories from grandparents and such, because that was in many ways the prevailing view, or putting iodine on a child's thumbs, or putting mittens on a child's thumb to prevent them from partaking in that natural urge to suck their thumb. And Dr. Holt was also a very strict believer in a rigid schedule. Every 4 hours that child must be fed, and And of course, there was very little latitude for that. So along comes Ben Spock, who had spent, as I mentioned before, 15 years at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, training for what he thought, he actually for a while thought he wanted to become a child psychiatrist. Deciding that he wanted to stay in pediatrics, he nevertheless tried to deal with one of his fundamental problems as a pediatrician. People would come in, and he realized that so many of the questions that parents would ask him in his day-to-day practice as a pediatrician was fundamentally psychological. They would ask, why does my child act the way that they do? And Spock was exposed and very much trained in Freudian psychology, but so much of Freud's critique of the human psyche was an analysis of the adult and tracing it back to the childhood. What Spock was trying to do was see what he could do as a pediatrician to deal with those things at the outset, to try to, the problems, what he would call the common, everyday, ordinary problems, he would call it, were the type of things that he felt that he could bring to fore by marrying the wisdom of Freud, as he saw it, with the hardware, if you will, of pediatrics, the everyday advice. So he set out to try to translate Freud in that book, and I'll discuss that to some extent in this. I'll give you some examples about it. But if I could, just in general terms, you know, we've often heard of the theories of infantile sexuality, the oral, anal, and genital stage, that as Freud describes it. Now, Spock, who in his baby book never used Freud, never mentions Freud at all, certainly not in the first few editions for the first 20 years or so of that book, he doesn't mention Freud at all. What Ben explained to me was that what he's trying to do was explain what Freud meant in the practical, everyday advice of a parent who was trying to raise a child. So when he talks about, for instance, the urge to suck their thumb, Ben did not use the term oral stage, but what he would say was that a child has a desire for the satisfaction that sucking a thumb or sucking at the breast would provide. And in many ways, Spock was way ahead of his time in the 40s by being a very early and strong advocate of breastfeeding, not only for the pediatric concerns of it, but also because of what he considered to be the emotional sustenance that a child would receive from breastfeeding. Now bear in mind, when Spock is giving this advice in the 40s and 50s, and most of us are of the baby boom generation, most of the children of our generation were bottle fed. So here's Ben Spock very early on as an advocate of what many people at that time think is a rather antediluvian notion of breastfeeding. That's something that was done by primitive cultures, by not in the modern day America of the post-war era. So here's Ben suggesting this, and this is part of the rationale for his very early advocacy of breastfeeding. And of course, the baby boom comes along, and the book is exquisitely timed to this urge by a generation of Americans who are coming back after 2 decades of depression and World War, and in many ways want to start families in ways that they had to push off for many years. And they are turning to Dr. Spock's advice. When they, I just wanted to read a little bit briefly from my book and just say, just explain again how Spock, just give you some of the examples of how Spock, in his baby book, tried to translate some of Freud. This is what Spock wrote in the very first editions of his baby book. He wrote, "A baby nurses eagerly for 2 separate reasons. First, because he's hungry. Second, because he loves to suck. It was hard to resist, as I explained, the happiness and loves in Spock's explanation. As he further wrote in the baby book, feeding is his great joy. He gets his first ideas about the world and about people from the person who feeds him. Later on, he talks about toilet training. And of course, he didn't mention the phrase, the anal period, perhaps as Freud would. But he advises parents not to follow the path that they were at that time following, which was having children potty trained by 9 months. Now, I have 3 children. That sounds to me, almost like Mission Impossible, training children within 9 months. But Spock said, use your common sense. It's not that he necessarily went from one end of the spectrum to the other end. Always it was the way in which a wise teacher suggests things to his audience and brings them along. I think, though, one of the things that I think is also very important to understand about Spock is that he did 2 things about dealing with the role of men and women within family life in America. For mothers, one of the things that Spock did was give a certain dignity and a confidence to parents. Before Spock came along, and it's almost hard to imagine just how damaging this was, I think, to the psyche of a lot of parents, particularly mothers. The books would, by and large, scold parents. They would speak down. I am the authority, and I will tell you. And if you do not follow my words of wisdom, all hell will break loose with your child, and it will be you who will be to blame. In so many words, that's precisely what Watson and Holt said in their book, directly and indirectly. Spock begins his book by saying, trust yourself. You know more than you think you do. And in many ways, that very early line is almost could have been written by Thoreau. It's so fundamentally American. But it also was very, to use one of today's terms, empowering to parents. And it gave mothers the confidence to follow their own common sense. It also bestowed a certain dignity to the whole process of parenting, because fundamentally what Spock said was that what parenting is about is nothing short of continuing the species along. And what could be more important than doing precisely that? For fathers, though, and I think this is something that's kind of interesting, particularly as you look back on it, one of the things that he said to fathers was, hey, Dad, in so many words, you can't come home and say, as you would see in the 1950s type of Ozzie and Harriet world, honey, I'm home, and look for the pipe and retire to the den, and off you go. And child rearing was essentially the role and obligation of mothers. Spock said, fathers, parenting is a two-way street, and that the joys of parenting are not only for fathers, but also the burdens and the obligations as well. And so that shifting, that ground shift in the American home was also perpetuated by the advice that Spock gave. And for many parents, not only, obviously the quintessential example of Spock's book is your child is crying in the middle of the night, and they're colicky, or there's a bump on the head, or a high fever, and of course you turn to that exquisitely detailed index at the back of Spock's book, and you look up precisely the malady that your child is facing at that moment. But for those parents who read the book consistently, and it's extraordinary how many people turn to it and how often they turn to this book, it became not only a guide or an encyclopedia, but it became also, over the long haul, a way, an approach to child rearing. And I think in that sense, I've also tried to, in my book, look at its impact on America. Because of this, because of the great wisdom in the book, as I mentioned, the supremely practical advice, this book became a runaway bestseller almost within its first year. Within its first year, it sold about 750,000. And then from there on, as I mentioned, about 1 million copies. And for this, Ben Spock, by the 1950s, became one of the most beloved figures in American society. In fact, Russell Baker once wrote a column in, I believe it was the late 50s or early 60s. It said, the 10 most beloved things in America. He listed it. And just it's Russell Baker, I guess, with his inimitable style, would do. And on that list is Mom's Apple Pie, Jimmy Durante, Joe Louis. And on that list of most beloved figures is Ben Spock, Dr. Spock. In many ways, by this point, Dr. Spock has become, the book and the man have become almost synonymous. And I'll speak about his personal life in a moment, because there were things going on in his life which made him become more in need of trying to be out there and be a teacher. As I mentioned before about starting out in life, in many ways, Ben grew up, as he later said, fearing that he would be a mother's boy. And in many ways, he was a mother's boy. His oldest sister, who will be 94, and lives here in Maine, said to me that in many ways, Ben Spock was the male version of Mildred Spock. And in many ways, Ben incorporated so much of his mother's views of things. But he was a very shy boy, and it was in many ways sports that brought him out. He grew to be 6'4", so that in many ways he seemed like the Shaquille O'Neal, if you will, of the Yale crew team. There he is, 6'4". Most of the other folks on the team are just barely hitting 6 feet, if that. And it's crew that brings him out and makes him a man, a real man. And he goes off to Columbia, as I mentioned. But before he does, he meets Jane Spock. And Jane Spock is absolutely crucial to the story of Dr. Spock, Ben Spock. What Jane does is introduce him to Freud. When they move to New York, Ben has hung out a shingle as a practicing pediatrician, but it's come along just at the worst possible moment. The Great Depression has come along. And Jane gets a job at Columbia, doing a study with a doctor there who's looking at the correlation between gastrointestinal problems and psychological problems. And it's there that Jane is introduced to the views of Freud. And through Jane's analysis, much of her family problems, her father died of syphilis and was an alcoholic himself, and he, in exploring her troubled background, her troubled childhood, comes home crying. And Spock is very much perplexed about this and becomes more and more intrigued by the principles of Freud. And it leads him eventually to go to the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and get the type of training that I've been talking about. But also in his personal life, Jane Spock is in many ways the person who believes in Ben Spock even more than Ben did. I was fortunate enough to find in my research literally a duffel bag of letters that were found in Jane Spock's remains when she died. Her various different materials. She had this duffel bag of letters from the 20s on, and in many ways, the love song of Ben and Jane Spock comes alive in these letters. When she goes off to Europe with her family, and then when he goes over with the Yale crew team to Paris and wins the Olympic. It's all recorded in these letters in a way that I guess these days the closest that we have is elaborate email messages to one another. But it's really a lost art of letter writing. And in many ways, their lives come this love story between Ben and Jane come alive. What happens, though, is during the 30s and the 40s, Ben begins to work on the book, and by 1944, the book is, after about 4 years or so, 3 to 4 years of every night Ben and Jane writing the book is done. And I cannot undervalue or underestimate the importance of Jane Spock to this book. No less an authority than T. Berry Brazelton, the well-known pediatrician, who's also a family friend of the Spocks and knew Jane Spock quite well, say that in many ways Jane didn't get her due for this book. And fundamentally, it's not to say that Jane wrote the book, but every night Ben Spock would dictate that book while Jane sat there and typed it up. And when he was sent away to the Pacific with the Navy and was over in California for a long period of time, it was she who handled all the copy of the text, did some of the background research, and handled all the questions from the publisher. She made sure that the advice rang true, that it rang true emotionally, that it basically, her experiences as a mother, but also her experiences as a person well-versed in the wisdom of Freud, was reflected in a very plain-spoken way in this baby book. And so it's very much a joint triumph, this book. The baby book is not only a validation for Ben, but is in many ways the culmination of this incredible joint project that reflects their love and is one of the great byproducts of their marriage. Shortly thereafter, Ben gets an offer from the Mayo Clinic, and it's a wonderful offer professionally. It's a type of offer where he could combine pediatrics and psychology in a way, at that stage of the game particularly, medical schools wouldn't even entertain that notion. So here it is, the Mayo Clinic giving him this offer, and he takes it, and off they go to Rochester, Minnesota. And they do so over Jane's very strong objections, and Ben does it for really, in many ways, sheer careerism. It's a dream job. How could I not take this job? He, in so many words, tells Jane. So off they go, and she hates it. It's cold, it's lonely. New York, which has been home for the Spocks for their entire adult lives. By this point, they're in their early 40s. They feel separated from, and Jane begins to drink. And by the time in which Ben goes to the University of Pittsburgh in the early 50s, Jane is hospitalized for 6 months at a residential psychiatric facility in New York. It's run by Cornell. In fact, many of the same people that he knew as a young doctor were people running this program at Cornell. This is up in Westchester County. So in many ways, there's this incredible crisis going on in Spock's life in the early 50s. And part of the reason why Spock, one of the reasons why Spock begins to write for Ladies' Home Journal, and then later has a TV show on NBC, Ask Dr. Spock Questions. This all comes about because in the early 50s, because when he's at the Mayo Clinic, he's not allowed to do any type of popular writing. The medical school won't allow that. So he has such overwhelming medical bills, though, primarily because of Jane's hospitalization, that he needs the dough, very, very simply. And you know, a lot of authors will complain that they have signed the worst contract in the history of book publishing, but arguably Dr. Spock, who wrote the greatest selling book ever written in America. In fact, arguably, signed one of the worst contracts ever signed by an author, which was ultimately changed years later. But he got a penny per book. For every book that was sold, he got a penny. The teacher in Ben, the pamphleteer, and I guess to some extent the poor businessman in Ben said, well, I just want to get it out. I just want to get it out to as many people. And even when I asked him at 92 or so, what was the secret of the success? He said it was because it was cheap. And, you know, it was 25 cents. Excuse me, 25 cents, and then quickly up to 35 cents. But that indeed is part of the appeal. But he makes no money for many years off of this book, no real money. So much so that when he gets the contract with Ladies' Home Journal, he's making more money by writing a monthly column for them than he is from royalties from the greatest selling book ever written in America. And he needs so because he's got this incredible crisis at home, which is really ripping his family apart. And yet, we as a people are looking at Dr. Spock, the ultimate father figure of the baby boom, the father of the baby boom. And here we are with Life magazine, coming to the home of Dr. Spock. And Jane, who was aware of the need to project this image and went along with it as well. I mean, she was part of that, and she recognized that. Nevertheless, there was never any hint, obviously, of the crisis that was going on in their life. And when I asked Ben about how dealing with Jane's alcoholism, which plagued their marriage until it ended in divorce in 1974, why couldn't he deal with it? A lot of it had to do with psychoanalysis. He would say, well, Jane has been in analysis. Indeed, she had been seeing a series of therapists over almost in her entire adult life. And for Spock, frankly, it almost became a crutch that he would say, well, I don't have to deal with it. I don't really need to see this, if you will. She's dealing with it. I'm a doctor. I'm respecting the relationship between the therapist and the patient here, the client. And so that's kind of compartmentalized. So Ben kept on, in many ways, like many men, certainly of that era, along the career path. And this was something that I think he really didn't come to terms with in his life till much, much later. And in many ways, the central drama, if you will, of my book, and Kathy, you know, having read it, you know, in many ways it's like a big soap opera, to be perfectly blunt, because so much of their family and friends are trying to say, who is at fault here? Was it Dan, who kind of got caught up in being the famous Dr. Spock and that careerism? Or was it Jane and her self-destructive behavior? Was she never given the credit that she was due? And that certainly was Jane's contention. And it was something that's played an impact on their family life was really quite remarkable. I say that also because, like most lives, it's not so neatly compartmentalized. It's not so neatly, we can't very easily come to a summary about Dr. Spock. Because as he often said to me late in life, as an very old man, 92, 93, talking to a man you know, in his late 30s and early 40s during the course of the research for this book, you know, he said to me at one point, I remember very distinctly saying that I knew what I was doing was intellectually wrong. I knew that it was not the right thing to be doing, and yet it's almost as though Ben, who had grown up in a relatively conservative, a very conservative politically, but also a rigid and emotionally restrained family, couldn't bring himself to impart the type of wisdom that his book was able to give to thousands. So in many ways, you literally had the circumstance, the crisis of Dr. Spock's life, personal life, was that he couldn't take his own advice, that this wisdom for which he was one of the most beloved figures in America, he himself had difficulty following. It's It's one of them, to me, it was an extraordinary irony, and it had, in many respects, its tragic consequences, which he spent so much of his life trying to rectify. Also, if I could, I'd like to talk a little bit about Spock's political views and how his view of human nature, expressed in pediatric and in that marriage of psychology, was later expressed in politics. In fact, I think Spock often felt as if the light had gone on over his head a little bit late in life, and he was late 50s, early 60s, when he kind of came to the conclusion, as he later kind of boiled it down, that pediatrics is politics. And historically, he's absolutely right. You look at everyone from John Locke to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Ben Franklin, they all were pretty well known in their own time for giving out child-rearing advice. How you see a child growing up is rooted in many ways in your view of human nature. What is this vessel, this human vessel, capable of containing, and how much of a difference can we make in a child's life? And so he realized that it went beyond just the individual practice of a pediatrician, but that he had an obligation as one of the most well-known figures and beloved figures in our society to start speaking out on issues that affect children. He first spoke out about the rise of the radioactive iodine that he was seeing in cow's milk, and he was very much concerned about that. Later, he's lassoed into the Kennedy campaign in 1960. In fact, there's a television commercial with Jackie Kennedy and Dr. Spock together, and Jackie Kennedy says something to the effect that Dr. Spock is for my husband, and I'm for Dr. Spock. And but in many ways, Spock uses his cachet with the Kennedys to warn John Kennedy in a private letter that I found in the Kennedy Library, written in 1962. It's a letter that Ben writes and says, "Don't get involved in Vietnam. It's fundamentally a civil war. If we get involved in that, we're going to get suckered into it, and we won't be able to get out." And it's an extraordinarily prescient letter. 1962, he's warning Kennedy about this. But in many ways, you know, the fundamental liberalism, in its best sense, the view that good nurturing, that good parenting, good schools, a better community will result in better children, a better generation, was expressed in many ways in the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. So after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson, again in the '64 campaign, asked Dr. Spock to do a television commercial, and indeed he does. And Lyndon Johnson loves the fact that Dr. Spock, and along with these other scientists, have supported him on television. And shortly after the '64 election, Lyndon Johnson calls Spock and says, "Dr. Spock, I hope I will be worthy of your trust." And Ben Spock, who always saw fundamentally the best in people, said, "Well, of course, Mr. President, I'm sure you will be." And about 3 or 4 months later, in early 1965, Dr. Spock, like a lot of Americans, realized that Lyndon Johnson had lied. And in many ways, Ben Spock becomes the first major celebrity, if you will, major big figure, to come out in the streets and protest against the Vietnam War. That's in March of 1965. It takes almost 2 years for him to convince Martin Luther King, as an example, to come out against the Vietnam War. King had his own concerns about alienating Johnson, who was a very big advocate of the civil rights movement. So that was a major factor in King's slowness to come out against the war. But Spock was, in many ways, broke with that view that a lot of Americans had of him as an apolitical doctor. And for this outspokenness, really what I consider to be a real strong act of moral courage, he gets copies of the book sent back to him with traitor written and copies torn up and sent back. But in yet many ways, his fundamental view about the Great Society was in many ways the manifestation of this view about nurturing. As I just in wrapping up, just talking about Spock and looking at his life and what it means to us, I think he had lived long enough to see this nature versus nurture pendulum, if you will, go back and forth a couple of different times. And in many ways, Dr. Spock was Dr. Nurture. If you had to look at him what he did was take the Freudian psychology and fundamentally popularize it, make it accessible and understandable to America in ways that no other vehicle provided. But it also, he was able to endure over the last 25 years the belief that a child's fate is all encoded in the DNA structure, and that you really can't have much impact as a parent. It's all, Johnny or Janie is just playing out what's fated to be in their biochemical makeup. And it's interesting to see that in the last few years of Ben Spock's life, a lot of the new neuroscience has once again kind of re-emphasized the importance of nurturing on a children's life, that there's a window, if you will, on the first few years of a child's life where you really can make a difference. And it was kind of ironic that some of the publications said, covering all of this, said Dr. Spock was right. Just one last closing comment. I remember seeing Ben at the Russian Tea Room in New York. He came to New York to give a talk, and shortly afterwards we went out to lunch at the Russian Tea Room, and I remember two vivid things about that. One was that if I lived to be 92 or 93, that I could hope that I could walk down 57th Street with the same jauntiness that Spock possessed on that afternoon. And the other thing that I recall is the belovedness that still people had for Dr. Spock. I mean, this is the type of love that people have for a friend, a true friend, somebody who, when you're desperate in the middle of the night and your child is screaming and you're out of your mind with fatigue, Dr. Spock is there up on the shelf. He's the friend that you turn to for that piece of advice or comfort that can help you get through that crisis. And you could see it reflected on those people who would say, "Oh, Dr. Spock," and would tell them the individual stories. In many ways, it was encapsulated by a Peanuts cartoon where you can see Lucy and Charlie Brown talking, and they're looking at a book, and they go for the first 3 or 4 frames, and finally at the 4th and final frame, Charlie Brown, they're looking up at this book after saying, "Oh yes," Charlie Brown looks up and says, "Good old Dr. Spock." Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to take it. Well, I really appreciate you coming.
I appreciate you. It was nice to have you up there.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, America Morel. I really enjoyed your lecture. And I would love the
Sure.
input from
Who should I make?
Erica with K.
Were you a Spock baby?
I'm not quite sure. You'll have to ask my mother. I'm sure I probably was. Definitely a Freudian baby. That's for sure.
We were kidding around before about, Jerry was saying we should put me next to the couch and have the book on the couch. I should analyze the book.
Image, idealized image, publicly, because it's not these were like just a lot of admiration and bad though when they became your wife. Once an analyst told me,
But it was really a pleasure, and certainly reading the interviews and writings, I've been keeping actually clippings on the book and sending them to my mom. A lot of what critics were saying, you kind of got some people a little bit heated up with some of this stuff. It was very interesting to read all of a sudden when you bring a lot of things up.
Anything but
about
indifference.
somebody. Yeah, all of a sudden it was like, it's not completely who they thought, so it almost brings them on the defensive a little bit, you know, like based on their romantic image of the person and then what they were, you know, some of the things that they were reading. There were some people, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, it's a little hard right now to remember, but I think one reviewer was saying a lot of positive things about the book, but that they were shocked and almost like you'd taken the ears off of Mickey Mouse.
Right, sure.
Like,
Oh, yeah.
You know, Dr. Spock exposed.
Well, it's interesting to see the reviews after Ben died
Right.
than before. Before, some of the reviews said, boy, he's really tough on the old boy.
Right.
And it's interesting to see because we're almost more able to look at somebody after they're dead with a certain clarity that death brings than we are when we're still dealing with them and they're alive. So it's kind of very interesting to see the
Yeah,
reaction.
but I was very interested because I thought, you know, it kind of went beyond the average book reviews, because really you were getting people's like personal feelings about the man versus kind of what they were reading in the book.
I think a lot of people also looking at the story of Ben and Jane Spock.
Right.
I think a lot of people look to take sides in that type of story. Was Ben right or wrong? Was Jane right or wrong? And it's in many ways you almost have to go through the whole story until you kind of figure out who was right or wrong. And frankly, it's not an easy call one way or the other. So,
But it was a pleasure.
thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, how are you? To mom and dad.
Right. To mom and dad.
I'm sorry. Should I make it out?
Lauren Morel.
Please spell.
Lauren.
I'm sorry, L?
Oh, Auren.
Oh, right, but I was saying that they were interested in and they hired.
Were you a Spock baby by any chance? Or are you a Morel baby?
It's a mix of both. So.
Well, thanks a lot, Laura.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Lord?
Hi, how is it? Duke Potter.
Do you want me to make out?
Could you please?
Surely. I should make it out to
Duke Potter.
D-U-K-E?
Yeah.
D-U-K-E, Potter. P-O-T-T-E-R? I even write with erasable ink, just to make sure I don't get it.
You were a Spock.
Absolutely. Yeah. My mother thought that was a Bible.
Sure.
But I was interested in not so much the dichotomy of his having such trouble with his own kids, but the thing that interested me was that what he wrote was so galvanized and succinct, and the duplicity of that he was so sort of, there was a miasma with his kids. He was not clear at all, you know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And, you know, he was a wonderful writer and obviously a terrific teacher as well. A lot of people who were students of his at various different medical schools talk about what a great teacher, what a great communicator, as we would say. And yet he gave out such mixed messages to his family. It's extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. And, you know, it makes you wonder about to what extent we as parents, how much can we take advice? Or are we doomed, as his youngest son would say, are we almost destined to play out the way that, to be the parents to our children the same way that our parents were to us? Are we just almost a series of parenting styles cascading from generation to generation?
The things that I took away from my parents, I mean, I rejected certain things, obviously, as you're supposed to. But the things that I took with me of value were the things, not that they sat down and talked to me about the things that I learned from example. I know my dad was just punctilious about shaving every day and combing his hair. And even in the summertime, he would never wear Bermuda shorts. He would always wear like chinos. He just was, he would always want to look put together and not so he'd look handsome, just because he just thought it was a good way to be, way to live your life. And I remember thinking, my little 5-year-old mind, what a great way to, that's, I had friends' fathers who sit with a can of beer and a